Is the Trudeau government really looking to make Canadian news organizations acquire a license in order to practice journalism here in Canada? It seems like there are some plans in place to make this happen, but what exactly does this mean and how would this change media as a whole? First, be sure to like this video and subscribe to keep getting more. Here at The Pulse, we come together to make sense of important and complicated topics while asking deeper questions about where truth can lead us in creating a better and more conscious society. So much of this story revolves around the controversial Bill C-10. It's a federal bill that here in Canada that seeks to change the amount of power regulatory agencies ultimately have over streaming and online content. Many have dubbed this bill the government's attempt to regulate the internet. Back in May of 2020, during an episode of The Question Period on CTV, host Evan Solomon asked Canadian Heritage Minister Steven Guilbeault if Canadian content providers would ultimately need to get a license in order to operate. Guilbeault responded by saying, "As far as the licensing is concerned, if you're a distributor of content in Canada, and obviously if you're a very small media organization, the requirement probably wouldn't be the same if you're Facebook or Google. There would have to be some proportionality embedded into this, but we would ask that they have a license, yes." Now, these statements suggested that companies like Google, Facebook, or Netflix, all who distribute content here in Canada, would have to apply for a license here in Canada and of course abide by all the standards and regulations in order to keep providing their content to Canadians. This also suggests that news organizations here in Canada would have to do the same thing. Now, after this episode aired, a great deal of backlash ensued because obviously people were starting to think, well, this is the government's attempt to start regulating the news. And days later, the Heritage Minister began to walk back his statements. Let me be clear, our government has no intention to impose licensing requirements on news organizations, nor will we try to regulate news content. We are committed to a free and independent press, which is essential to our democracy. Our focus will be, and always has been, to ensure that Canadians have access to a diversity of high quality and credible news sources. Now, is he suddenly backtracking on the statements because, the statements he made went a little bit too far in revealing the underlying intentions of government, or did he truly misspeak? We can't entirely know, but it would be naive not to ask these questions because, after all, up to this point, why should we be trusting what it is that government says, knowing the history and what has been happening over the last few years here in Canada with regards to the government says one thing and then does something completely different? I mean, this is a trend that's been going on for a very long time, and it seems upon us as people to start asking deeper questions about what the government intentions truly are. Now, the license itself does exist. If approved, a news company would be considered a qualified Canadian journalism organization. Now, you might assume that any independent media outlet that applies for this license would not be able to get it, but this isn't entirely true. So far, the Western Standard, which is an independent media organization here in Canada, has gone public showing that they were approved by this panel, government panel, and they are now a licensed journalism organization here in Canada. Now, apparently the panel that did review the application from Western Standard did have some concerns, and I quote here, "They had concerns about the journalistic processes and principles, particular with regard to its coverage of the COVID-19 pandemic." So we're seeing here that even though the government didn't ultimately like the way the news organization covered COVID-19 and felt that some of their content was misleading, they still gave them a license as a official news organization here in Canada. Now, this indicates, of course, that things aren't always as black and white as simply saying anybody who detracts from what the government is saying is just going to be shut down. On the other hand, another news organization here in Canada called Rebel News recently applied for the license and was denied. According to Rebel News, the government panel who reviewed their request said that only 1% of their content was considered news and therefore they were not eligible. Now, to note, the Western Standard did not apply for any of the $600 million in media bailout that the Trudeau government has offered. Money that largely has been going to small and independent media outlets out there, not just the big legacy media outlets that many feel is where the money is all going to. I mean, we've heard over and over again that the Trudeau government, basically just bought the legacy media by giving them $600 million. Again, ultimately pointing to the idea that things aren't super black and white when it comes to these issues, but we need to be open, engaged, and looking at them with, a curious lens in order to figure out what's actually going on here. And of course, this $600 million is separate from the $1.4 billion that the CBC gets for their entire network, which includes anything from TV shows to films and documentaries, as well as their news platform, making CBC the only news organization that is state-sponsored here in Canada. Nonetheless, you can see the potential issues with this license if it's used from an authoritarian manner, something that the Trudeau government has had no problem doing in other areas of their government policy. Even though the Heritage Minister claims the government has no intention to make news organizations in Canada get a license nor regulate the news, can we really trust that that is the case? Remember that back in May of 2021, Trudeau said that in Canada, we don't do mandatory vaccination and we need to respect people's choices.
I understand that holding out the, hey, if you want to go to a ball game or a concert, you're going to need to get vaccinated as a motivator for people to try and force them to get vaccinated. But like I said, what do you do with someone with an allergy? What do you do with someone who's immunocompromised, or someone who for religious or deep convictions decides that no, they're not going to get a vaccine? We're not a country.
What do you do?
Well, we're not a country that makes vaccination mandatory, for example.
And of course, it was only a few months after he was saying that he changed his policy around mandatory vax and started calling those who didn't get vaccinated misogynistic, racist, and of course extremists. So how long until the same "we're not going to regulate news or force news organizations to get licenses" becomes a thing of the past? Or maybe those news organizations who don't get licenses won't be seen as credible anymore. Or maybe they won't be allowed to participate on Facebook or YouTube or attend conferences here in Canada, something that some people are already suspecting is what's ultimately going to happen. So it'd be like the government saying, hey, yeah, you can still practice news here in Canada. We aren't going to stop you. All the while having a boot on their neck the entire time that they're actually trying to do any reasonable news or get access to people or places that they need to get access to in order to tell, honest and clear news about what's going on the ground. So that's very similar sentiment to the whole, you don't need to get vaccinated, but you'll lose your job, you'll lose your right to do things in public, and you won't even be able to get on a plane. So again, we've seen the government sort of say one thing and do something different, or package something up in something that sounds great, but it actually isn't the greatest, which is again why we need to be vigilant about how we look at this story. All that said, the truth is all of these stories are coming to light as part of a process of people ultimately waking up to what's really going on in our reality and understanding how things are truly functioning. This is ultimately pulling our faith and power away from what's happening inside government, and it's kind of pushing it back to how can we truly solve the problems and create alternative solutions to what the government is proposing, because it doesn't seem to be in our best interest anyway. That's ultimately the process that's occurring. So while it can be tough to look at some of these realities of what's going on and to feel the authoritarianism that's coming out from government, and it can feel lonely to do this in a sense by ourselves sometimes is what it feels like, at the same time, there is peace in knowing that there is a growing amount of awareness, there's a growing amount of sentiment that's starting to be shared by people in seeing what's truly going on. And governments in many ways are starting to appear desperate in their attempt to take authoritarian power over many, many aspects of our society. So this is ultimately a call to stay strong, stay grounded, and keep spreading the word about what's going on here. Here at The Pulse, we trust it's clear by now that there is so much set up to shut down, limit, or stop the funding and success of independent media, but that's why we need to consider how we invest in keeping independent media alive as people. If you like our work here at The Pulse and you want to keep us doing this stuff and see it continue, please consider becoming a member of our Explorer Lounge. By doing so, you're investing directly into our impactful work, and you're also getting some cool member benefits as well. Check it out in the link below, and of course, liking and sharing this video and spreading around to other people is also immensely helpful. See you next time.